Late last summer, as we were completing the research and writing of Plan B 3.0, there was a raft of stories on ice melting. You may remember some of them. One reported that in 1 week, an area of Arctic sea ice the size of the UK had disappeared. And scientists were stunned by this. They hadn't seen anything quite like it before. And then a few weeks later, there was a report from a team of scientists studying one of the glacial outflows from the Greenland ice sheet. As you know, Greenland is covered with a huge ice sheet. It's about a mile thick. And then there are various outflows from that ice sheet. These glacial outflows move the ice from the continent into the Atlantic Ocean as more and more snow accumulates more ice on top each year. And what was interesting here, more than interesting, it was shocking, is that the rate of glacial flow, which traditionally is 100 meters a year or maybe 200 meters a year in various glacial outflows around the world, here this glacier, the Ilulissat Glacier, 3 miles wide and a mile thick, was flowing at 2 meters an hour. I mean, you could literally see it moving. And apparently the ice melting on the surface of the ice sheet was working its way down through the glacier, and the water was flowing under the glacier to the ocean and lubricating the flow of the glacier. So with this flow of 2 meters an hour, periodically large chunks would break off and slide into the ocean. And when that happened, given the size of this, weighing billions of tons, there would be literally a seismic response, a mini earthquake, as billions of tons of pressure were suddenly released from the land. Again, scientists had never seen anything like this before. Last year, we were also getting reports from China, from a team of Chinese scientists who have been studying the glaciers of China for 20 years. These are the glaciers on the Tibetan plateau, for example. And they reported that those glaciers not only were melting and shrinking, but at an accelerating rate. And they talked about the possibility of an ecological catastrophe if this continued. At the same time, scientists in India were realizing that the glaciers in the Himalayas that feed the Indus and the Ganges were melting also very rapidly. Many of the smaller glaciers, the scientists now say, could be gone within a few decades, and some of the larger ones over the next several decades if we continue with business as usual. It is the ice melt from these glaciers that sustains the river flow of the major rivers of Asia during the dry season. Without these glaciers, many of the major rivers like the Ganges or the Yellow River in China would stop flowing during the dry season, would flow only during the rainy season. And this obviously would disrupt irrigation water flows in both India and China. Why is this important? China is the world's #1 wheat producer. India is the #2 wheat producer. The US is #3. I think we tend to think the US is #1, but it's not. China is #1, India #2, the US #3. China and India totally dominate the world rice harvest. What happens to these glaciers, and therefore what happens to the wheat and rice harvests of China, will affect food prices everywhere. Imagine China facing water shortages from falling water tables and wells going dry, and glaciers drying up and rivers not flowing for part of the year, and China having to come to the world market for a large share of its grain supplies. Today, China imports 70% of its soybeans. It's gone from 0 a dozen years ago to 70%. If China goes into the world market for large quantities of grain, it will necessarily come to the United States. We are facing the prospect that 1.3 billion Chinese with rapidly rising incomes may, before too many years go by, be competing with us for our grain supplies, driving up our food prices. Now, historically, if something like that had happened, we would restrict grain exports. We did that in the 1970s when grain prices took off. We can't do that with China. China is our banker. And there are limits to what you can do with your banker. We don't need to go beyond ice melting to know that civilization is in trouble. If the Greenland ice sheet goes, and it won't go overnight, it'll take time, but if it goes, sea level rises 23 feet. If the West Antarctic ice sheet goes, and it's maybe the most vulnerable ice sheet in the world right now, sea level rises 15 feet. It is melting both on the top from rising air temperatures and underneath from rising water temperatures. If it goes, we get another 15-foot rise in sea level. The World Bank published a map showing that a 1-meter rise in sea level would cover half the rice land in Bangladesh, a country of 151 million people. Many of the world's coastal cities would be partly, if not entirely, inundated if the Greenland ice sheet were to go. We could be looking at hundreds of millions of rising sea refugees. Enormous stresses this would put on societies. So we're looking now at climate change, and again, I won't go beyond ice melting, just to give a sense of the sorts of problems that we're facing. Stresses on governments are building. They're building everywhere. This financial crisis that we're in is a manifestation of those stresses. Incidentally, the roots of this crisis and the roots of the environmental crisis are the same value sets, that is, consuming today with no concern for tomorrow. And that's not a winning philosophy over the long term. We're seeing stresses building on governments, particularly low-income governments with rapid rates of population growth. And if you look at the top 20 countries on the list of failing states, 14 or 15 of them have rapid rates of population growth, growing at close to 2% per year up to 3.5% per year. That's between, say, 4 and 7 children per family. This rapid population growth is leading to deforestation, to soil erosion, to overgrazing and grassland deterioration, to falling water tables and spreading water shortages. It's making it almost impossible for governments to build schools fast enough to provide education for all the youngsters coming of school age. It's making it difficult to provide even rudimentary healthcare services. So these countries are beginning to break down under the stresses. And now we have 2 new stresses: rising food prices and rising oil prices. Now they've both agricultural commodities and oil have been in decline in the last few months, but this is not more than a temporary situation. The long-term rise is clearly for rising oil prices. And as oil prices go up, grain prices will follow, because remember, we now have the capacity to convert grain into oil, i.e. ethanol. So the price of grain is now tied to the price of oil. If oil goes back up to $140, if it goes to $200, the price of grain will follow it up. Because if the food value of a commodity is less than its fuel value, the market will move that commodity into the energy economy. And this is all the result of the US, in an effort to reduce its oil insecurity, has created global food insecurity. And I don't think we've yet quite realized the dimensions of this problem. As we were working on Plan B and looking at the various manifestations of climate change, importantly ice melting, we asked ourselves not the question that political leaders ask of how much of a cut in carbon emissions is politically feasible. Instead, we ask the question, how much and how fast do we have to cut carbon emissions if we want to have a decent chance of saving the Greenland ice sheet, or at least the larger glaciers in the mountains of the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau? When you ask the latter question, or let me say, when you ask the former question, most political leaders now agree that we need to cut carbon emissions 80% because the scientists say we need to do that. But they talk about doing it by 2050. And I think the game is going to be over long before that. We think we've got to do it by 2020. And that means almost a wartime mobilization. Plan B has a three-component program to cut carbon emissions. One is to raise energy efficiency systematically throughout the world in all sectors. Two is the massive development of renewable energy resources. And three is banning deforestation and planting trees by the billion in order to sequester carbon. Let me give one example for efficiency. If we were to shift worldwide to the most efficient lighting technologies now available, which for most of the world would be compact fluorescent lights, we could lower world electricity consumption by 12%. That's enough to close 705 of the world's 2,400 coal-fired power plants. And it's actually a profitable thing to do. The rate of return on replacing incandescents with compact fluorescents is something like 25 or 30% per year, which is not a bad rate of return. Renewables. Today, we get 40% of our electricity from coal. In the Plan B energy economy of 2020, we get 40% of our electricity from wind. That will require about 1.5 million wind turbines. We have 100,000 or so in operation today. So 1.5 million wind turbines, 2 megawatts each, 3 million megawatts of generating capacity. Sounds like a lot of turbines, but we could produce those turbines for the entire world to reach this goal just using idled automobile assembly lines in the United States. We've got a dozen years to do it, not a big deal. Keep in mind, we produce in the world 65 million cars a year. We're talking about 1.5 million wind turbines over the next dozen years. Entirely doable if we want to do it. The exciting thing is that we're beginning to see a seismic shift in thinking about renewable energy. Instead of the marginal incremental gains that we've been seeing for some years now with another small wind farm here and another solar installation there, suddenly we're seeing progress in thinking on a scale that we've never seen before in any field of energy. It's extraordinary. We are in the early stages of a transition from an economy powered largely by oil, coal, and natural gas to one powered largely by wind, solar, and geothermal energy. A few examples. In this country, the state of Texas. Texas has for the last century been our leading oil-producing state. It is now our leading generator of electricity from wind, having overtaken California a couple of years ago. Texas now has 6,000 megawatts of wind generating capacity. It has another 39,000 megawatts under construction in the planning stages. That's a total of 45,000 megawatts. Think 45 coal-fired power plants. This is huge by any standard. When these wind farms are completed, they will produce enough electricity. They will produce electricity far in excess of what the 24 million people in Texas can consume. Texas will be a wind exporter. Amory Lovins, the energy efficiency guru whose name is familiar to most of you, was asked a question by Elizabeth Colbert, a writer for New Yorker magazine. Elizabeth was doing a profile of Amory, and she asked Amory about thinking outside the box. Amory said, "There is no box. There is no box." And that's where we need to be today. We are all sort of boxed in by our education, by our work experiences, by recent history, and our natural tendency is to think sort of narrowly within boxes. And suddenly, we're seeing this breakout thinking on a scale and at a rate that I could not have imagined a year ago. Consider South Dakota. Clipper Wind Power, based in California, and BP are developing a 5,050 megawatt wind farm in eastern South Dakota, close to the Iowa-Minnesota borders. 5,050 megawatts of wind generation will produce 5 times as much electricity as the 780,000 people in South Dakota will consume. This combine, this partnership between Clipper Wind and BP, has already bought an old railway, abandoned railway right-of-way that crosses Iowa into Illinois. Their plan is to build a transmission line across Iowa, feed into the Illinois grid, which is a heavy-duty grid, because they have a number of nuclear plants in Illinois, and export this South Dakota wind to the industrial heartland. I could go on with countless examples. Philip Anschutz, an oil person in Colorado for many years, now diversified into many other things, is building a 2,000 megawatt wind farm in Wyoming on the Colorado border, just west of the Continental Divide. He has also acquired a company that has transmission rights to build a transmission line from Wyoming to California, 900 miles. He sees this as an investment opportunity because he expects, as do I, that not only will he be building many more wind farms in Wyoming, but so will many other wind farm development companies. Enormous amount of wind in Wyoming and very few people. So we're beginning to see changes in thinking on a scale that did not seem possible a few years ago. Or consider Scotland. The government of Scotland is negotiating with 2 sovereign wealth firms in the Middle East. Sovereign usually means government, investment firms, to invest $7 billion in a grid off the east coast of Scotland in the North Sea. And this grid will be connected by undersea cable to the continent, the European continent. The Scots expect to be able to develop 60,000 megawatts of wind generating capacity with this investment in the grid. The total generating capacity in the UK today is probably under 100,000 megawatts. I mean, this is huge. We've never seen anything like this with fossil fuels or nuclear before, any sort of thinking on this grand scale. Or consider Algeria. Algeria, as you know, has long been an oil producer and exporter. It knows it will not be exporting oil much longer, but it plans to continue exporting energy. The Algerians are building, already started to build, but plan to build a total of 6,000 megawatts of solar thermal power plants. This is mirrors concentrating sunlight, boiling water, generating electricity. They planned to export this to Europe via undersea cable. They've already signed a contract for German government. They'll feed the electricity into the European grid. The Algerians have pointed out that they have enough harnessable wind energy in their desert, which is most of the country, to power the world economy. It sounds like must be a mathematical error, but it's not. The way this point often appears in the energy literature is simply to point out that the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth in 1 hour will power the world economy for 1 year. In this country, the Department of Energy in 1991 published a National Wind Resource Inventory pointing out that 3 of our states out of 50, North Dakota, Kansas, and Texas, had enough harnessable wind energy to satisfy national electricity needs. We now know that was a gross underestimate because it was based on the wind turbine technologies of 1991. In those days, wind turbines were about 120 feet tall, relatively small propellers. Today, they're 300 feet tall, harvesting a much more massive volume of wind. The DOE a couple years ago published another study pointing out that offshore we have enough wind power to harness to supply 70% of our national electricity consumption. I mention these numbers just to make the point that we have an abundance of renewable energy, wind and solar, and I haven't even talked about geothermal, which is huge. The challenge is how to harness these sources economically and get the energy to consumers in the form they can use, and in most cases it's in the form of electricity. Why have suddenly things begun to move so fast? I think it's a number of things. I think it's the rising price of oil, the growing oil insecurity, it's mounting concerns with climate change, it's the dependence on imported oil and the huge capital outflow associated with that. If that capital were kept here, we could invest in job creation. But there's another factor at work here, I've come to realize, and that was revealed in a comment by Boone Pickens. He was asked by a reporter why he, 80 years old, an oil man for 60 years, been in the business for decades, was suddenly wanting to invest $10 billion in a 4,000 megawatt wind farm in the Texas Panhandle. He said very simply, I've gotten tired of oil depletion curves. And the point he was making, that he was acknowledging, was that when you invest in a new oil field, as he's done at least a few times, you know that it's only a matter of decades till the oil well yields begin to drop. Then eventually you have to find another oil field if there's one to be found. If you invest in a coal mine, eventually the seams run out and you've got to find coal somewhere else. But if you invest in a wind farm and the associated infrastructure, you're investing in an energy system that can last as long as the Earth itself. I mean, obviously there are maintenance costs. You have to replace the bearings in the wind turbines and other parts from time to time. But the system is running on an energy source that's not going to be depleted. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution began, we now have the opportunity of building an energy system that can last forever. What a legacy to leave the next generation. We now have this potential. There are other countries I haven't even talked about. Turkey. Last year, Turkey issued a request for proposals to build wind farms. It was open to Turkish companies and international wind development companies. Turkey today has 34,000 megawatts of electrical generating capacity, total. they got proposals to build 78,000 megawatts of wind generating capacity. Now, there's some overlap among the proposals, but the Turkish Minister of Energy says that they plan to select 15,000 megawatts of the most promising proposals and to move ahead with them in the first wave of wind farm construction. Indonesia. Indonesia, an oil exporting country, an oil producing and until 2 years ago an oil exporting country. But Indonesia's oil production peaked a few years back, has been declining since then. For the last 2 years, it's been an oil importer. The Indonesians know they've got to find some other source of energy. They have decided to develop 6,800 megawatts of geothermal generating capacity. I point out in Plan B3.0 that Indonesia has more than 500 volcanoes, 131 of which are active, which means they have a lot of energy very close to the surface. So they're harnessing this. And the principal responsibility for this development of their geothermal resources lies with Pertamina, which is the Indonesian state oil company. Pertamina may be the first oil company, state or independent, to actually become primarily a renewable energy company, in this case, a geothermal energy company. Indonesia could satisfy all of its energy needs from geothermal energy alone. Another exciting option unfolds now as a result of two advances in technology. One, hybrid cars, and the other, advanced design wind turbines. Once you have a hybrid car, it's a relatively short step to a plug-in hybrid car. Indeed, if you own a Toyota Prius, you can buy a kit and convert it into a plug-in hybrid. It's basically adding a second storage battery and an extension cord, so you can plug it in at night and recharge the batteries. And then instead of getting 44 or 46 miles per gallon, you get 100 miles per gallon, because for much of the short distance driving, it will be on electricity alone. General Motors is planning to come to market in 2010 with the Chevrolet Volt, which it says, under typical US driving conditions, will get 151 miles per gallon. It will run largely on electricity. It will have an all-electric range of 40 miles. So if you use it for daily commuting and grocery shopping and so forth, you probably never will use any gasoline. You'll just use electricity. It's only if you go on a long drive that you would use gasoline. We have the potential now to build an entirely new automotive fuel economy, one where we have plug-in cars and where most of our electricity will be coming from wind. The cost of wind-generated electricity in gallon of gasoline equivalents is just under $1 a gallon. We can do it. President-elect Obama has talked about getting 1 million plug-in hybrids on the highway within the next, I've forgotten, by 2013 or whatever. We're going to have a press conference on Wednesday talking about ideas, possible ideas for the new administration. We will suggest that in exchange for bailing out Detroit, we require not only what President Obama has already said he wants, which is more fuel-efficient cars, but we will recommend a requirement for plug-in hybrids in the years ahead so that we can take advantage of all the wind energy we have. Imagine running our cars largely on wind energy. Extraordinary. Imagine how much oil imports will drop and how much capital we'll be keeping at home. And no one can embargo the wind supply. This is an exciting time, all sorts of possibilities. The question becomes, how do we get from here to there? And the most important thing, I think, and most economists would agree with this, is that we need to get the market to tell the environmental truth. The market does many things well. One of the things it does not do well is to incorporate the indirect costs in the prices of the goods and services that we buy. For example, it doesn't include the cost of climate change and the prices of fossil fuels. It does not include, the market does not include the cost of treating respiratory illnesses from breathing polluted air from burning fossil fuels. It does not include damage from acid rain. So the challenge is to incorporate these costs, and the easy way to do it is simply to reduce income taxes and raise the carbon tax. No change in the amount of tax we pay. Just over the next dozen years, keep each year lowering income taxes and raising carbon taxes until we finish the process. Then the market will take care of shifting investment patterns from fossil fuels to renewables. Another way of doing this, and this is one that's preferred by corporations, though not by most economists, that's the so-called cap and trade system. And that may be the system that Obama will go with. I suspect that in the end, we're going to end up with a combination of the two. But in a cap and trade system, you simply restrict the amount of carbon emissions. Let's say we're emitting 1 billion tons of carbon today. So then you cap it. If you want to reduce that by 20%, you cap carbon emissions at 800 million tons, and then you sell the rights to carbon emissions to the companies that are involved, to basically the major corporations in the country. And if any of their activities lead to carbon emissions, they have to buy carbon permits, and those permits are tradable. It has a flexibility that corporations like. When Sir Nicholas Stern, former chief economist of the World Bank, returned to his country, the UK, a few years ago, one of the first things the UK government did was to ask him to do a study of the future costs of climate change. When he released that study, he said, climate change is the result of a massive market failure. And by that he meant that because we had not incorporated the cost of climate change in the prices of gasoline or coal-fired electricity, we had the impression that fossil fuels were cheap, when in fact they're not. The costs are huge. We don't even know how big they will be. And it's not just the size of the costs, it's the consequences of climate change. I mentioned ice melting. I mean, how much are we willing to spend to avoid a 23-foot rise in sea level, for example, which could very well mean the end of civilization as we know it because of the enormous stresses it would pose. So today, sometimes economics almost becomes irrelevant. I remember with Sir Nicholas Stern's report, there was a big debate among economists on the discount rates. He had used a fairly low discount rate. They thought it should be a much higher discount rate. And I thought to myself, you know, the issue is not the discount rate. The issue is whether or not we can cut carbon emissions fast enough to save civilization. And that went right by economists. They seem not to realize, I mean, they're sort of trapped in the theory, in the economic boxes that we're, I mean, in economics 101, you're taught about external costs. And then you can get a PhD in economics if you want, but you never come back to it. And yet, it is the indirect costs that are shaping our future. Some of you will remember a corporation named Enron. In the late 1990s, Enron was probably on more business magazine covers than any other corporation in the country. Remarkable success, rising income, Earnings were jumping quarter by quarter. The darling of Wall Street. Amazing story. And then in late 2001, early 2002, some outside accountants began looking at Enron's books. And when they completed their audit, they discovered that Enron had developed some rather ingenious ways of leaving costs off the books. When those costs were included, Enron was worthless. It was essentially bankrupt. Its shares, which had been trading at $97, dropped to pennies. A corporation that had been the 7th most valuable corporation in the United States was worthless. We're doing exactly what Enron did, but on a far larger scale. We're leaving costs off the books. That's why it's so important to incorporate these costs by restructuring taxes or adopting a very aggressive cap and trade system. We've got to get the price of carbon emissions on the books in one form or another. Øystein Dahle, a Norwegian, last name D-A-H-L-E, was for many years Vice President of Exxon for Norway and the North Sea. And he later succeeded me as the chairman of the board of the World Watch Institute. Øystein said back in the late 1990s, socialism collapsed because it did not allow the market to tell the economic truth. Capitalism may collapse because it does not allow the market to tell the ecological truth. And I think he summed it up very well. Today, we are in a race between tipping points, natural tipping points and political tipping points. Can we close coal-fired power plants fast enough to save the Greenland ice sheet? Can we cut carbon emissions fast enough to save at least the larger glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau? I could go down the list, but this is the kind of race that we're in now. And this is why in Plan B3.0 we talk about a wartime mobilization. We have to take this seriously. One of my concerns is if we don't act quickly and decisively, we may have to answer questions in a few years that we'd rather not have to answer. For example, what if we don't get our act together and start cutting carbon emissions fast? And what if 3 years from now, the National Academy of Sciences issues a report saying, you know, it looks as though the Greenland ice sheet is going to go. It's past the point of no return. There's too much CO2 in the atmosphere. Temperature's rising too fast. We don't think we can save it. And then the next generation is looking at a 23-foot rise in sea level and hundreds of millions of rising sea refugees. Potential chaos in the world. And what when they say to us, why didn't you do something when there was still time? That's not going to be an easy question to answer because they'll read the same scientific literature that we now read. It's very clear that we've got a serious problem with climate change and that we are primarily responsible. We could see for the first time in history, at least to my knowledge, social fracturing along generational lines. We know social fracturing along racial and religious and ethnic lines, but we've never before seen it along generational lines. And then there's another question, and that is, if something like this happens, the Academy issuing this report, for example. And we realize what we've done or what we haven't done, how will it affect us, our sense of self, our sense of who we are? This is not a question that I can answer. It's a question for a psychiatrist. But it is the kind of thing that we now have to consider. There was an article in Newsweek recently that had an interesting sentence in it. It was about energy and climate change. And it said, business as usual is beginning to sound like the end of the world. I mean, they talked about the end of the world. I talk about the decline and collapse of civilization. But these are profound issues we're faced with. And the question that we need to deal with, I mean, let me back up and say, as environmentalists, we've been saying for some time that we need to save the planet. And that's true. But there's a more fundamental question now, and that is, how do we save civilization? These stresses are building, governments are failing, and if that trend continues, we're in trouble. We're in deep trouble as a civilization. When I look at the magnitude of what we need to do, the sort of changes, I sometimes go back and reread the economic history of World War II. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. January 6, 1942, President Roosevelt's State of the Union address, in which he laid out U.S. arms production goals. He said, we're going to produce 45,000 tanks, 60,000 planes, several thousand ships, 20,000 artillery and anti-aircraft guns. People have never seen numbers like this before. They were overwhelmed. They were skeptical. But what Roosevelt and his colleagues realized at the time was that the largest concentration of industrial power in the world was in the US automobile industry. Because even during the Depression, we were making 2 or 3 million cars a year. So he, after his State of the Union address, called in the leaders of the industry and said, we need to rely on you guys to help us reach these arms production goals because you represent such a large share of our industrial capacity. And they said, well, Mr. President, we're going to do everything we can, but it's going to be a stretch producing cars and all these arms too. He said, you don't understand. We're going to ban the sale of private automobiles in the United States. From the beginning of April 1942 until the end of 1944, there were essentially no cars produced in the United States. And we exceeded every one of those arms production goals. We produced not 60,000 planes, but 129,000 planes, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, troop transports, cargo transports. Even today, it's difficult to imagine producing 129,000 planes. The point of this example is it did not take decades to restructure the US industrial economy. It did not take years. We did it in a matter of months. If we did it then, we can do it now. Now we need to restructure the energy economy. My final point is this. Saving civilization is not a spectator sport. We all have a stake. Most of us have children, many of us have grandchildren. We need to get involved, politically involved. I'm often asked the question as I travel about the world, what can I do? And people expect me to say, change your light bulbs and recycle your newspapers. Those things are important. But we've got to go beyond that now. We have to change the structure of the economy, and we have to do it quickly. And that means becoming politically active. Not just voting in presidential campaigns or working in primaries, though they're terribly important, but continuously working. Pick an issue that's important to you. Opposing new coal-fired power plants. Join a population group to work to stabilize world population. Or develop a world-class recycling program in your community. These are the issues that we need to work on, and we don't have much time. And we can't just sit around watching and hope someone else is going to do it. We have to do it. It's going to take an enormous effort, but it's entirely doable if we all get involved.